As I begin using watercolor, I want to just show you the different options you have. I realize not everybody's going to have all of this, but you can go with simple watercolor sets that are just a few dollars. You're not going to have the vibrant colors. They will fade as they dry, but you know, this is a really affordable way to get used to using them. This set was maybe $10, maybe not even, and you have lots of colors. It's not terrible for a student quality set. You know, the colors stay pretty vibrant. I really like using the watercolor tubes where you just put the smallest little amount of paint onto a palette, and after you use it, they actually dry up and you can continue using the same one. So all of this is dry, but where I've mixed colors, those colors can be re-wet and used. So they dry just like the watercolor pans that, you know, these are dried paints that you add water to them. So that's what happens with the tubes as well. You don't want to paint straight out of the tube. You have to add water to it. Otherwise, it's real sticky, it's shiny, it doesn't apply well. So they're small tubes that you just put the smallest amount onto your palette, you add water, and it spreads very much like any of the other watercolor paint. This is my favorite set. It's a travel set. I used each color as a color chart so you could see what it looks like. They're very vibrant. It did cost more, but with a coupon at Michael's, you know, that's always the way to go. And I've had these for several years and I still have a ton of paint left. So it's worth the investment to buy that nicer quality paint, but it lasts forever. I still have a lot of colors and it's a travel set, so I can close it. There's a little palette where I've mixed colors, and it actually comes with a brush that you put the water right into, so you can take it with you, and it's fairly small, like that's the size of my hand. So I like that one the best. And then last but not least, you can get watercolor pencils. So they act a lot like a colored pencil, but you're able to draw small detail and then add water to it and paint over top of it, or dip the tip of the pencil into water and it becomes softer and it will spread more. So if you really like to draw, but you want that painted look, these are a really nice option too. So I'm going to set everything aside, get out my painting, and with watercolor paints, I like to use 2 cups of water. That's because as you work, it gets pretty muddy pretty quickly. So I use 1 set or 1 cup of water as the cup that I dip my brush in to swirl off the last color I was using. I use the other one to dip in before I'm putting it into a new color, so it's much cleaner. And then a paper towel. And I've chosen 3 brushes today for the size that I'll be needing here. Obviously this is one of my favorite brushes. It's starting to lose the paint on the handle, but it's a nice detail brush. This one will cover much larger areas, but because it goes into a point, I can still get into pretty small spaces. This one's just really soft and a nice round brush that fits into small to medium places. So whenever I begin, I'm going to look back at the color again, just to decide where some of those shadows and highlights need to be. We're going to paint in layers. We're going to start with something called a wash of color. So if I were to look at this flower in particular, this really light peachy color is what I paint first, all over the entire thing. That's going to be the first layer. Then everywhere that it's darker, I'm going to paint another layer that will build on top of it and be a little darker, so it will blend in and create that gradual blend of light to dark from the highlights into the shadows. So I'm not done once I get 1 coat of paint on here. So what I'm going to do is start off by wetting my brush. I'm starting with my biggest brush. Notice that I already took the time to erase. So when I say erase, I went over top of all of my heavy lines so that my entire drawing is still visible. And it's a little more visible to me, I think, than it is to you on the video. But it's a ghost image. So I didn't waste my time by drawing everything and then erasing it. What I did was I created that base outline of everything, And I just want it light enough that it's not going to be noticeably obvious. I don't want the outlines to be obvious. Something I did forget to grab, and I'm going to reach right now to get it, is something called a dab sheet, or like your scrap paper where you can experiment on. So sometimes you want to dab your brush off if you don't want as dark of a color. And so I'll take one piece of paper and just cut it into strips or cut it into smaller pieces and use for this purpose. So let's begin by experimenting. I'm looking at, I have that color chart, which is nice. If you don't have a color chart made, it doesn't take long and it can be very helpful. And we can make these any color you want. I kind of like this orangish color here, so I'm gonna stick with this one. And I'm coming in, adding water to my paint, which is making it pretty vibrant. So I'm going to add a little bit more water. And this is why for this first stroke, I want to dab it on here and see how dark it's going to be. That's really dark compared to what I actually want. So a way to get around that is to create a wash by putting a layer of water, just a thin layer. It's not like I'm making a big puddle, but I'm actually painting all inside this outline, everywhere that my rose is. So I know it's hard to see because it's clear, but I'm filling this in with the water, making sure it isn't a puddle. And then I'm dipping into this color because it's still wet on my paper. I can just pick it up with the tip of my brush and now fill in that whole area, and it waters it down enough. If I don't have enough paint left on here, I'm going to dip back into my palette and see how dark it is. That's a little too dark, so then I just rinse off my brush, kind of dab off the extra water, and spread that one dab of paint all throughout. Because it's already wet, it spreads and bleeds all over the place. And it's only going to spread and bleed where you have the water. It will stop before it goes into the outlines of the background or the leaves or anything else. When you're painting with watercolor, you want to be very patient. You need to plan things out a little bit more, or a little better than you have to with acrylic paint, because acrylic you can just paint right over. It takes a couple minutes to dry. It goes exactly where you want it. Where I'm placing the colors for watercolor has to be planned out a little better, because if I were to do the green of the leaf that's right next to this, or let's say I go with a pink flower as my filler flower, if I do the pink that's touching here, it's just going to bleed together and you won't see the nice crisp outline of each individual flower anymore. It's going to look like a blurred mess. It will look more abstract, and it's not like you can't do that, but it might not be the exact same effect that you're going for. So what I'm doing instead is I went with those thrillers, those bigger flowers that are my bold focal flowers, focal points. And I am filling in all of those at the same time with the wash. I only want the wash on it though, because I want it to be light and then be able to layer the darker colors. So I kind of purposely made this a little darker than I wanted so you can see what happens. See how nice and light that is? This is more of a mid-tone. Might be a little much. So I take my paper towel, I press straight down, I lift straight up. And that usually lifts just enough color that I'm good with it. If it lifts too much, you can always add just a little bit more. Just a tiny little tip of color on my brush and respread. You don't want to rub your paper. You want to press down, lift up, leave it alone. Because if you rub at your paper, then you're going to get a hole, or like, you know how the paper will pill, where it gets like little bumps and it'll start peeling off. So you just want to apply light pressure and never rub the paper. So I'm adding my wash of water, my layer of water, then I'm adding a layer of the paint, spreading that out, and if I have too much on my brush, I just keep spreading it into other areas, or clean off my brush, get rid of the extra water and spread it even more. And just keep moving from one flower to the next. So I'm going to fast forward through this part for the rest of my roses because I'm doing the same exact thing over and over. So you can see it happen, you can pause the video, you can work at your own speed. Next up are my filler flowers. So since they're pretty small, I'm going to go with my smaller brushes and decide what color I want for them. I'm not going to spend as much time creating that wash. Instead, I'm going to just jump right in to the color. I want to go with a bit of a pink for all of these small flowers, but I want to pick a brush that it is pretty fast to paint the petals. So one that is a similar size. If you're not sure, that's what this dab sheet is for. Just kind of try out the petals for one flower. I'm still making a wash. I'm not adding detail yet, but I am going to go in and go around my entire painting and add in the color to every one of the flowers, which you may or may not be able to see as well as I am, but I'm able to see the outlines. I don't have to re-dip for every flower, and some of them might look a little darker than others, and that's okay, because you want them to be a bit unique. But if they do get too dark, just use your paper towel, press the paper towel onto it and lift up, and it will lift some of that color. The other thing that I do is, because I'm right-handed, I work top to bottom, left to right. So I don't want to have to go back up over here and do something because this hand could potentially smear this. You know, I'm lifting above these, they're starting to dry, but because they were a light wash, it doesn't take a long time for the color to dry before you can work on something near it or next to it. But I do keep my hand lifted up away from my paper. Just dip the tiniest bit of paint onto the tip of my brush. And if I'm too close to something that's still wet, I can wait on those petals. So what I just did is I pressed it to feel it. It's just barely damp, so that means I should be safe. If it's still fairly wet, or you can see that it's wet because it's still glossy, or that there's a puddle there, hold off on that petal, because then that pink is going to smear, and not smear, but like bleed into that flower. So I am holding my brush a bit more like a pencil now, where I get a little closer and I'm being more careful with what I'm doing, where normally I'm holding my brush up above and like letting it be a little more flowy, but because these are smaller, I feel like I need more control, and by holding it like a pencil, I have a little better control over it. So again, everything is just a wash. It's looking flat. It's not going to have a ton of detail yet. We're going to create a little bit of a shadow, a little bit of depth later on with, oh, I just went on my lavender. If you get a color where you don't want it, take your brush, clean it off, dip in your clean water if you need to, add a little bit of water to it, and then press down. And it might not get rid of the color completely, but it should lighten it enough that you'll be able to go over it with your other color, because I forgot that this was kind of tucked behind there. So just going in and finishing this. Rather than coming across here, now I'm going to come back over, work my way from my left to the right again. So essentially what I'm doing is creating a base layer of the main color of the flower, what you're going to see the most, but what is the lightest section of it. Then you'll go back and you will add shadows and deeper, darker colors and some little outlines. So this will be for all of my groupings. This color I'm using for the multiple flowers that are happening, but I'll come in and still have to paint my lavender and my leaves and my stems. So again, for a wash of color, you're just watching me paint my basic shapes in. It's not all that interesting. So I am going to choose a lavender or a purplish color for my lavender. And I'm going to choose a fairly medium green for my leaves and my stems. And when I come back and talk later, it will be how to go over all of the shading, highlighting, how to create layers. But there's no sense in me making this take forever and you just watching me paint a base layer for each thing. The only thing that I do want you to remember is that it is very important to stay away from wet spots unless you want them to bleed together. So since I want each and every one of my colors to be standing alone, be the petals, I have to make sure that, I knew that that wasn't wet anymore before I painted this right next to it. So the next thing that I do is going to be the lavender, because it's not really touching other flowers so much. That will give everything time to dry before I go to the greens, because my greens are touching these flowers more. And watercolor doesn't take that long to dry, just a few minutes really. But if you're really impatient, you can just get out a hairdryer, or if you have a heat gun, if you're a crafter. I know I have a heat gun for like embossing. If you stamp and you put embossing powder on it, it makes it feel like it's raised up. But they get really hot really fast, so you don't really need to hit the paper for too long. It's just a quick bit of air or heat to help dry it. But honestly, they usually dry so fast I don't have to get that out. Alright, a couple things to notice are I went in, I painted the rest of my color. I went through and got all of the lavender, the flower heads, but then I painted my stems and my leaves. Before I completely called it done with the green, I used a very watered down green and also filled in between my stems and my leaves, because otherwise it looked very flat still. But if there were a lot of layers and if you could see around the full bouquet, there'd be more of these flowers on the other side. So you're seeing kind of like a hint of those greens that would be showing through and like stuck down throughout the middle of the bouquet. The next thing I'm going to do is create the shadows that are within our rose. So I'm using my detail brush, the smallest brush that I have. I'm using the same color that I started with, so I'm re-wetting that because it's now dry on my palette again. And I'm going in, I'm going to start with this nice big flower here just so you can really see. Everywhere that I want it dark, I'm going to go in with that same color, and I am going to outline it, but I'm not going to leave it just an outline. I'm going to spread and allow this to look like it blends from light, medium to dark. So that's whenever I get another brush, and I like the brush that I have that is pretty small but it's pointy, and I'm dipping it in that clean cup of water. Then what I do is I just smear the edge of my stripe. So that means I don't want to do too much at once. In fact, it's already starting to dry just a little bit. So I need to get that darker color there, and then I spread it out and I dip my brush in that water so that it starts letting this bleed throughout that whole section of the petal. So it's not just a stripe. This middle part I'm going to leave pretty dark. But I'm not covering the entire thing. So what I'm doing is I'm adding the stripe of color, and then I'm coming around it so it looks like it's going down inside the flower. Spreading that a bit. If I need to, I'm rinsing off the extra and coming back with just water. But I'm not going clear to the edge of my petal because at the edge I want it to look very bright and highlighted. So it seems like it takes a while at first, but once you get the hang of it, I promise you it doesn't take that long. So I might do 1 or 2 petals at a time. Wet my next brush, start spreading, which helps spread that stripe out so it's a little larger. Clean it off one more time, and right at the edge of that spread out stripe, I'm usually going in like a circle or just kind of pulling that color upward and outward. So that it spreads. 2 is a little too much. It's kind of warm where I'm sitting right now. So I think because of that warmth, it is drying very quickly. You'll notice that you'll figure out what your drying rate is. You know, on a cooler day, and believe me, it's cold, but I have the heat cranked up because I'm freezing all the time. But on a day whenever the house is just cooler, or if I'm sitting outside and it's a chilly afternoon, the paint takes a lot longer to dry. But do you see how this is starting to look like there's actually petals overlapping? It is beginning to look like there is a separation between one petal to the next. It's not just one big blob of color. And I didn't totally cover up what I had originally painted. I'm not trying to repaint and do double the work. It's that I need that light wash to be there to be my lightest, brightest highlights, so that I can put the color over top for the shadows. And you can mix colors. So roses are so many different varieties that I don't expect you to have the same color as I do. I want you to be unique with it. So hopefully you have experimented, and maybe you want like a pink with a little hint of yellow on the tip of it. The one color that, like this rose, this is what I'm talking about, where maybe your wash of color was this light yellow and now you're adding pink into it. Maybe it is red, and to get a deeper red for your shadows, you could be using like a purple. So it's completely up to you what colors you do. You know, I could add a yellow into this easily and it would look very nice because it would blend well. So I'm going to go to another one. And I typically work from the inside out. It's definitely your preference, but just work in small sections so that it doesn't just dry in a stripe, but you're able to blend. Still allowing that light color to show. But look at the dimension that's happening. So I'll finish this one and then I'll do what I have been doing, where I'll fast forward through it so you can still see the progress of each flower, but I don't really have anything else to say about it. And then I'll come back and add texture to all the little flowers, the leaves. You know, I'll just work on one thing at a time. Add a shadow underneath the side of this rose. And if the top of my petal starts blending in, I just grab my paper towel, dab up the water, come back with more paint if I need to. Make things lighter and darker depending on where you would be seeing the light hit it versus the light being blocked. And also what angle it's coming from. Maybe it would be darker on one side versus another. But now we're starting to see all those differences. For the details on the lavender and these smaller flowers, I don't need a lot of paint, but I want to just create a little bit more dimension. So I'm using that tiny detail brush again so that I can go in and make some darker lines, and a lot like the squiggles that I had drawn originally. I'm going to create that second layer so that we have a little bit more dimension to it. So that's one of the things that I need to do next. The other is create a little more dimension on each of those tiny little 5-petal flowers. not only am I putting these squiggles, but I'm going to go back in and just put a slightly darker amount along one side or the other to give it a hint of a shadow so that it's not just even across. There's part of my paintbrush, since it's so well loved. Just chipping off right onto my painting. Quick tip, if you have a paintbrush that starts shedding, you do want to replace it. I don't care about the paint on the handle. I'll use a paintbrush until my bristles are no longer good. But if you have a paintbrush that is shedding any of its bristles and it starts looking like you have an animal growing off of it, it's time to replace it. When you're washing your brushes, make sure you're washing in cool or lukewarm water. Nothing too hot, because there's glue that is holding those bristles in there. And hot water is going to melt that glue, and you're never getting that back. It'll just continue to shed. So don't ruin your brushes by washing in too hot of water. Okay, so I'm going to stop this for a minute and focus on the pinks. One thing I want to do is create a center. See how much more dimensional these are looking than these over here? But now I want these to become a little different, nothing too crazy. I don't want to outline so much as I want to create a little bit of depth to it. So I'm dipping in and I'm starting in the center and I'm just kind of bringing color out. And if it becomes too much of a line, then I can clean my brush off and just come in and smear it a little bit. But what I want to do is make it look like it's a little darker in the center and it's getting lighter toward the tips of the petals. Also could be giving it some shadow, like a little bit of a shadow between the petals where it's overlapping. So if it's just overkill, add water, spread it out. This brush might not be the best for it. I'm going to go to that next size up so that I can smear that, and since it was just too much paint, lift it a tiny bit, get a little more. So here I go, creating the depth between these flowers. I haven't found a happy medium yet of how much water and how much paint, and that just sometimes takes time. So as you are painting, you'll start feeling what you need to do, how much water needs to be on the tip of your brush before you dip it into the paint. There we go. Now it's starting to cooperate a little better where it's not overkill. And I'm liking the results of that. So I'll continue with both the lavender and these smaller flowers, and then come back to talk about the greenery so that there's more depth there. Definitely want to look like there's some shadows deep within the bouquet. All right, so there's already a little bit of variation between the greens. I have quite a few greens to choose from on here, and because I have my color chart, I know what they can look like. So I used this one, and I want to make it a little darker as I add some of the detail. I want to create some shadows within. I want to show the veins. So I'm going to come in with a different green for some of these veins showing through. But then to make it darker, I'm going to utilize the same color that I had before. And I also want to give it a jagged edge along the bigger leaves. So I'm still sticking with this small brush so that I can just go along the edge and kind of tap or dab a textural roughness to it, but then just kind of spread some of this color throughout the leaf as well to make it blend and not look so flat. So each time I do this, I'm just creating that dabbed effect, dipping in and adding a little bit of water and then spreading that out within the leaf. I'm not sure if you've noticed how much it faded as it dried. You know, not everything stays a super vibrant color. So watercolor tends to look a little lighter after it's dry. And then sometimes I want to go back in and just make things darker like I had anticipated they would be. Once you start painting with it a little more often, you can just kind of gain an understanding of what each of the colors do and what the different paints, if you're using a different type of paint, what it'll look like when it is dry. It just takes some practice. So if something faded to such a light color that you were surprised, the nice thing about it is you just layer it again in any way you want, but instead of layering it fully, this is a great way to give you the opportunity to start blending your color through and creating some curves and some depth to it. Everything shouldn't look so flat, and it does whenever it just has that one layer. So notice that now we have some really pale areas that are happening. You know, you're seeing this darker leaf stand out a little more. And as I work, I'm going to just take a look at what's happening around each of my flowers and decide if something needs to look like it's going back into, like, toward the center of the bouquet, because it's going to get darker when it's back there. It's going to look like there's not as much light being hit. Trying to talk and paint at the same time, and half my thought just kind of stops. So I want it to look like it's more concentrated, or it's, you know, the bouquet is kind of full or tight within the center of it, that the light is not shining down into it. So that's where I want to create a little bit more of a darkness in the filler and within these leaves. But I'm already starting to see that happen. So that's why this really small brush is great for just, you know, some of the lines. I'm going to be a little more sporadic with it. It doesn't have to be perfect, like where everything is lining up just so. But it's just making things stand out a little bit more, since it does have the green in the background to begin with. And each of us will have our own style, so you might be someone who wants to control it and really outline and make it look as realistic as possible. You might be someone who's okay with it looking a little more painterly or abstracted. You know, it's okay to have your own style about things. Don't try to make it look exactly like what someone else is doing, because then you're just going to struggle and be upset whenever it's not like a perfect image or replication of what I'm doing here. The masters used to have to train and copy from other masters, and that is a really good way to improve your techniques, enhance your observational skills. But for stuff like this, I want to see how unique you can make it. I want to see, I'm going to start adding some leaf shapes too, not just stems. I want to see how each of these can be more unique, and what you do to it to give it its own character. Another thing that you may notice is that my paper's curling up just a little bit, depending on the quality of paper that you buy. And I do think it's important to buy watercolor paper. It's definitely more pricey whenever you get like a sketchbook full of mixed media or watercolor paper than drawing paper. But if you're going to be using watercolors, it will save a lot of frustration. It's worth the 50 cents or $1 per piece of paper. You don't have to use it for anything but this. You know, you can practice and draw on printer paper, and then you can transfer your drawing over to this if you're not sure that you want to create a painting out of one of your sketches. It's not like you have to ruin your good paper. But when it gets wet, it does tend to curl a little, so I could have taped it down onto my table. I like to move my paper. You might have noticed that it was upside down at some point. And if I'm using a piece of paper that I know isn't as high of quality and is really going to curl, I will tape it onto like a clipboard, or we have some scrap plexiglass in the garage that if anybody's nearby, we have lots of it and I can share that. But, you know, I just use scrap wood or whatever is in the garage for things like that as well. All right, there's one leaf there that I kind of forgot for this rose. This is getting there. It's just about done. Where there's lots of lights and darks now. The only thing that I'm seeing that I want to do is make a few of my shadows within my roses a little darker. And that is more noticeable now because I did take a break. And in between painting, I just needed to get up. Sometimes whenever you paint for a while, you just need to get up and walk away from it and kind of take a look at it after you come back. Let's be honest, I was hungry. It was time to make dinner. So I took a break, I came back, and these are fully dry now. They're not just damp like they were before, so they did get a little bit more faded as they dried. So I'm going to go back in, and you can see where I added those little highlights of yellow, but I do around the middle of the painting, especially. That's where I want to create that darker area. This paint, the color that I was using, this one here, when I add it to the center, it's not really making it darker now. So what I'm going to do now is go for a new color. Another quick thing is some of my colors are a little muddy or they've gotten dirty. So this orange has a little bit of something else on it. So I'm just spreading water over top of it, cleaning my brush out a few times, and that makes it disappear. If it's really dirty, like check out this yellow here, I can do that. Scrub out that dark color. And then if it's still not quite gone, just take my paper towel and dab it and lift it up, and now it's clean. But what I want to do to create a bit more of a shadow is use a darker color. So I'm going to try the orange first. If that's not quite dark enough, that's not bad. That's pretty good. I was going to say I might go to this reddish orange, but I think that might be too much for it. So just mostly in the center. I'm not going to go too far out. I'm going to add just a little bit of the orange and go back and do the same thing I did before where I blend it out so it's not just a stripe of orange. I want there to be enough of a contrast to tell that it goes down deep inside the flower. It's not just around the edge of it. So anything that's just not quite up to par when you're looking at it, if those colors just haven't given you the vibrancy that you want it to have, just a few extra brush strokes here and there. It's usually all that takes. So there I go, putting it in, cleaning off my brush and spreading. So I'll do that on a few more. And then I'm calling it done. I'm pretty happy with how this went. Oh, no, I'm not. Anybody notice what I forgot? Way down at the bottom, there's no color to the vase. If it's a glass vase, it's very possible you wouldn't really see much. And I have flowers overhanging enough that I also don't necessarily need to change too much of it, but I need to make sure that we're seeing the edge, that we're seeing a little glare, or like how if you look at a glass, the outside edge of it might look a little grayish or silverish. So I don't think that I'm going to go with a dark color for my vase, but I do want to at least show that there's an edge to it. The leaf is over top of the one edge over here, but I'm going to wipe my brush clean, come in here, check my black. It's a little too dark just by putting it on my dab sheet here. So I'm going to water it down and just come in with a slight amount of the gray at the edge and just kind of a few lines here and there to make it look like it glares. Now I feel like I can call it done.